My name's Colleen Chogan, and I'm a novelist, but I also work at the White House Historical Association, and I'm very honored to be moderating this panel this afternoon at the National Book Festival. I'm joined on stage today by Louis Byard and Karen Joy Fowler. Louis Byard is the author of Jackie and Me. He also is the author of several other novels, including The Pale Blue Eye, Courting Mr. Lincoln, and Roosevelt's Beast. He was a finalist for the Edgar and Dagger Awards, and he teaches at George Washington University. Karen Joy Fowler's novels have included the Jane Austen Book Club, Sister Noon, and We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. And good news, Booth was nominated for the long list for the 2002 Booker Prize, correct? So congratulations, Karen.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, isn't it terrific? I also worked at the Library of Congress for over 10 years and before my current position, and I am so happy to be back in person at the National Book Festival this summer. We are going to do Q&A at the end of this session, the last 15 minutes, so if you have questions, save them up and come to the microphones. And both Karen and Lou will be signing books right after this session from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. downstairs on the convention floor. So both of these novels are works of historical fiction, but they couldn't be about two more divergent historical figures. We have one of the most beloved people in American history, Jackie Kennedy. We also have, Karen, your book is not necessarily about John Wilkes Booth, but it's about the Booth family. And of course, John Wilkes Booth is one of the most reviled characters in American history. So tell us, to start out, why did you choose these individuals to focus your novels? What struck you about them and why were you drawn to them? Karen, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I came to this book on a sort of circuitous route, starting with a short story that I wrote about time travel. And the impetus for the story was that I had been reading some time travel stories and I was annoyed at how easily people from the future seemed to slip into the past and go undetected about whatever their nefarious agenda was. And I thought, I live in Santa Cruz, California. It's a tourist town. I know the tourists when I see them. If I can spot someone from Kansas, I think I could spot someone from 200 years in the future. So I wrote a short story which took place on the day of Lincoln's assassination, and Washington, D.C. is filled with time travelers, that it's become a sort of destination vacation. And in the course of researching that, I started looking at the Booth family, and I wrote another short story which was about Edwin Booth's return to the stage after the assassination. And then I wrote another short story about a funeral that Junius Booth, the father of this clan, gave for some passenger pigeons that he'd bought at the market. He bought a gravesite and he tried to get a reverend to officiate over this funeral. And the reverend refused to do it, but he went home and he wrote up the entire evening. And my short story is based on that. So when I started thinking about the problem of the mass shootings with which we are so plagued, I just had the Booths in my head for so long that it just seemed natural to think about the most famous shooter in American history and wonder what that had done to his family, what it was like to be a brother or sister of John Wilkes Booth. And that's how I began the story.
Great. Lou?
I just want to say one of the things I love about being at the National Book Festival is having your words translated for you by these wonderful interpreters. It's such a beautiful, beautiful experience. Thank you. And I get to watch it straight on. So the book began not with Jackie, but with the Me. And the Me character was somebody named Lem Billings, whom I'd never heard of until 4 years ago. I got a copy of my college alumni magazine, And on the cover was young John Kennedy. Back in the 1930s, he was briefly for 6 months an undergraduate at Princeton. And that was interesting, but there was also this guy next to him with his arm wrapped around him, and it was Jack's best friend, Kirk Lemoyne Billings, known as Lem to everybody who knew him, and known really for being Jack's best friend. That was his job, at least in his own mind. He had his own career in advertising, but that was his role in life, and he played it to the hilt. He was a visitor to the White House every weekend. He had his own room. The Secret Service waved him in. He's this Zelig-like presence at the back of a lot of official White House photographs, just wandering through the Rose Garden while ceremonies are happening. The more I learned about him, the more he fascinated me, this idea of, I guess my model was remains of the day, somebody who's devoted his whole life to a particular man, to a particular system, and how does that work out for you in the end if you don't have a life of your own? But one of the things that I realized was that he also was very close to Jackie, and that he had a front row seat for the Jack and Jackie courtship. I thought, well, what a wonderful observer he would be for that. And wouldn't it be great to have him tell this story from his own perspective? So he's telling it as an old man in 1981 New York and reminiscing about this relationship he had and about the choice that he has to ultimately make between which friend he needs to answer to in the end. So.
I noticed that you immediately think of Remains of the Day. My mind immediately went to Tonto and the Lone Ranger. Sidekick.
I've also gotten Great Gatsby allusions too, which I welcome, of course. Yeah.
So tell us, both of you, about your process for writing historical fiction. It seems very intimidating to me. It's nothing I've ever tried. I've written history and I've written fiction, but I've never put them together. So talk to us about your research process. How do you situate a fictional story within a well-developed history? How do you go about that? Lou, can you start us off?
Sure. I remember, because I was on a panel with Karen just a little while ago, and as I recall, you spent a year just doing straight-up research. I just answered for you, and I apologize.
Yeah. No,
I use that.
It's perfect.
I use that as a contrast to my own method. Is I do a few months of upfront research just to kind of ground myself, and then I just start itching to write and see what's there. And then the book educates me about what I still need to know, which is often considerable. And I never, at the end of this process, feel like I'm an expert on anything I write about. I just learn enough to tell the story that I want to tell. And it's just an ongoing weave. I will add, too, a plug for the Library of Congress. And my dear friend Abby Yokelson, who's out there in the world, who's I call her my research angel. It's just been, it's a wonderful resource to have, to live 6 blocks away from and to avail yourself of. Now, especially now that you're back in action, I need to renew my study shelf after 3 years. And so it's just this steady diligence of trying to figure out what I still need to know.
It will now surprise you to learn that I read for about a year before before I start, and that year is I think of it as I'm looking for my story. I'm seeing what is available to me, what I will be able to find, and what I may not be able to find. It's by far the best year of writing that I do, when there's actually no writing involved.
Pure possibility at that point, right?
Yeah, no, it's going to be wonderful. It could be so wonderful. In Booth, I did something that I have never done before, and which I actually felt quite uncomfortable about. While simultaneously thoroughly enjoying it, which is that I've written historical novels before, but they've always been fictional stories set in a historical period. An actual historical figure may wander through the background, but my characters are people I've made up. And really only the setting is historical, or there may be events that are also historical. So this is the first time that I took on the task of actually trying to imagine real people and trying to be fair to them as best I was able to, while all the while depending very firmly on my assumption that everybody who reads the book will understand that I don't really know what Edwin Booth was thinking at the dinner table when his father was telling stories about Sam Houston. Because they're, you know, pretending that you know a person that you don't actually know is awkward, I think. What do you think?
I don't. Once you've gone down the road of imagining your way into any character, to me it almost doesn't matter whether they really existed or not. It's the same effrontery is going on.
So both the Booth family and Jackie Kennedy and the Kennedy family have very long mythologies attached to them. Is it easier or harder to write historical fiction about someone with such a long mythology attached to them? Is that something you can engage with, or is that something that's kind of, and sometimes could be a hindrance as you're trying to think of the story?
I guess I would say that it's a bit of both for me, that, you know, it was certainly an issue that, that there is so much mythology around the Booth family. And because I was feeling so trepidatious about working with actual people and trying not to impose too much of my own imagination on to the, at least to the events that they experienced, you know, I felt I had to tread very carefully. For example, if you have somebody reminiscing about John Wilkes Booth, it's really critical to know if this interview happened prior to the assassination or after the assassination, because our memories are incredibly malleable. And people were paying, newspapers were paying for stories about the Booth family. So there was a great incentive to provide them with things that they might find tantalizing. Mm-hmm. So it was very tricky to try to determine. But all historical fiction, you know, it's rooted in memory, which we know is completely unreliable. It's rooted in eyewitness accounts, which we likewise know are completely unreliable. It's filtered through the agenda of whoever is telling the story. It's just a minefield.
Mm-hmm. So history is the real fiction, right? is what I'm saying. It's interesting you bring up mythology. I assume that because so many of the events in Jackie and Me took place within living memory, that there would be some sort of consensus in a way there couldn't be for a 19th century story. And yet there isn't. You go back through the various accounts and there's no agreement on when Jack and Jackie met, where, how, when he proposed to her. All these sort of major events in their courtship are still kind of subject to controversy and conflicting sources. So that to me frees me up, is to say, okay, well, if they can't agree, then I can just make this what I need to be. But in terms of the Kennedy mythology, I came to that as kind of agnostic. I was born 8 days after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, so I didn't buy into any myths. I just kind of went at them as any other subject. You know, Jackie at one point compares meeting the Kennedys to being Margaret Mead. You know, going into the jungle with a pith helmet. And that's kind of how I felt, and because I didn't have any prejudices going in, it was easy. That made it easier for me.
Mm-hmm. Now, these books couldn't be more divergent with their topic material, their subject matter, but I did find a common thread through them. Karen, your book does not focus on John Wilkes Booth. It's on the lesser-known relationships amongst the family and the siblings. And Lou, your book doesn't focus on Jackie Kennedy and John Kennedy. It focuses, as you said, between Lem Billings and Jackie Kennedy, certainly a lesser-known relationship. So why did you choose these lesser-known stories, these lesser-known relationships to focus on for the subject of historical fiction? Why was that so fascinating for you to be the focus?
Well, I always maintain that historical fiction's job is to fill the gaps in the historical record and tell the stories that don't get told. And there are so many stories that don't get told. Traditionally, they've been people of color and they've been women. But in the case of Lem Billings, here was a guy who was the close intimate of John F. Kennedy. Nobody knew about him. And I thought, particularly as a closeted gay man, I thought he would have a really interesting perspective to bring on this particular world and on these particular characters. So to me, it's just about finding the story that is still waiting to be told.
Mm-hmm.
I felt a real distaste for the idea of writing a book about John Wilkes Booth. I thought, you know, this is a man who craved attention, and he has gotten more than enough over the years. I didn't think he deserved mine. And I sort of went into it thinking, you know, that I had this mission, that I wanted to persuade people that people who don't murder presidents can be just as interesting as people who do. And I, you know, having now spent a lot of time thinking about and reading about the Booth family, I would not even put him in the top 4 most interesting Booths. But it, you know, it was this this sort of Zen koan throughout that I'm pretending I'm not writing a book about John Wilkes Booth when we all know I wouldn't be writing the book without John Wilkes Booth. This sort of constant, no, this is not a book about the character everybody is most interested in. Absolutely not.
So Karen, your book talks about the trials and tribulations of this family, the Booth family, as it's leading up to the Civil War. And so slavery plays a role. The history of slavery and slavery itself plays a role in your book. And in fact, parallel to the Booth family is the Hall family, who is an enslaved family not owned by the Booths by a neighbor, but the Booths profited from their labor. So tell us about why you decided to include the Hall family in this story, and what role do they play, you know, in the story?
I think the story of the Hall family is a fascinating one, and as is so often the case, as Lou was saying about the stories not told, there's not a lot of information. And again, you know, I think they are only remembered because of their proximity to John Wilkes Booth. So there is one small pamphlet about them and about their offspring that I leaned on very heavily. But, you know, I mean, slavery is the big issue in everything that's happening at the time. And you see a sort of generational split that the older Booths, the parents, grew up in England and came to the U.S. And so slavery was shocking to them. It was something that they had difficulty imagining and then had difficulty living with. The children grew up with it all around them. They are not a slave-owning family, the Booths. They were actually quite opposed to slavery, with the exception of John Wilkes. But I think for the younger kids, it seemed natural to them in the way that your own family seems natural to you until you get a little older and you take a more careful look at the way your parents behave and realize that, no, there is nothing normal about this at all. And I think that, you know, that the Booth children had to go through that revelation in a way, aided, I would assume, by their parents, who never supported slavery. And it's an interesting fact, I guess, that I think John Wilkes spent so much less time with his father than the other children did, and that his father was very opposed to slavery, and John Wilkes is the only one who repudiated his father's position on that.
So one more question, Karen. I found the character of Rosalie in your book, who is a sister, a sibling, very interesting. And then I did a little reading and found out that Rosalie existed, but she was mostly a creative invention by you because you didn't have a lot of facts to work on for Rosalie. So tell us about why you wanted to insert Rosalie into the story, and how do you do that when you have very little to work with?
I wanted Rosalie because, as was the case with so many families, as was certainly the case with the Lincolns, the Booth family had 4 children who died during childhood. And I feel that the family was severely warped by this, this very commonplace and yet unendurable occurrence. And Rosalie would have been the only child old enough to remember these dead siblings. The 4 who were at the tail end of the family were almost all born after these deaths. And so I felt I needed Rosalie as a witness to these horrific events. And it is very true that I had very little to go on with her. But what I had was so fantastic. She never married, but she fell in love early in her life with a lion tamer. And you see, the story writes itself. Her father felt that this was beneath her as a Booth. He put a quick end to it. She lived the rest of her life romance-free, but she clung to this golden romance that she had with the lion tamer, so much so that in the last years of her life, she told people that he had been killed and eaten by his lions, when in fact he had married and was running a hotel in Ohio. And again, you know, I don't have a lot, but what a character unfolds from this woman who would rather you believe that her long-lost romance was killed and eaten by lions than that he married someone else and is running a hotel in Ohio.
Right. I thought she was the most tragic figure in the book. I thought, you know, and the one that I was the most intrigued by, for sure. Lou, you mentioned one of your characters, the main character, the narrator, Lem Billings, is a closeted gay man. This takes place in the 1950s. Now, that's never explicitly said, actually, in the book, and I wanted you to talk to us about why it's not explicitly discussed. Is that a reflection of the times, and you were trying to match the times? And also, I was interested in Jackie's reaction to Lem. She doesn't seem to mind, or she doesn't mention it either. So I wanted you to talk to us a little bit about how you dealt with that particular fact.
Sure. Well, apparently Jack and Jackie both knew that Lem was gay. It was just one of those accepted things, and they were very live and let live on that subject in a way that was unusual for that era. But the reason that word, the G word, never comes up is well, it was relatively, we're talking about the 1950s, so it would have been homosexual or queer or something more derogatory. But they were hunted people. There's a scene in here which is invented, where Lem comes afoul of an undercover cop in Lafayette Park. And it just shows kind of what was going on for gay people in those days. They were used to, they had to hide to make any sort of connection. So any connections that Lem would have made would have been furtive, would have been on the down low, and would have fraught with danger. So it's no surprise, I met a few gay men of that generation. They never referred to themselves as gay. It was a lot of code words, and I think it's just because that's how they survived those days. Remember, McCarthy went after homosexuals with every bit as much vehemence as he went communists. Hundreds, thousands of homosexuals were arrested and kicked out of their government jobs. So it was a really fraught time, and that informs everything. Carrying on down to the 1981, when Lem is telling the story, he still can't use those words. He still doesn't define himself that way. He refuses to. But to me, that's just a sad result of the times he grew up in.
So Karen's book is a lot about family. Your book is about friendship, and this friendship particularly between Jackie and Lem. And it seems to me this is right before the period where Jackie is going to marry John Kennedy, but it seems to me that she so desperately needs a friend during this time, and this is what kind of throws them together. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship, the friendship that you created between Jackie and Lem, and why do you think she needed a friend so much at this period of time?
Yeah. That's a great point. The Times reviewer, Liz Egan, said that loneliness is sort of present on every page of the book, and I think she's right. And the loneliness for Lem is just somebody who's kind of forfeited his own personal life in order to be of use to the Kennedy family. Jackie's loneliness, I think, is just a function of where she is in her own life at this time. She's a year out of college. She graduated from George Washington University, yeah. I walk by her the building that's named after her all the time. And she's in the middle of she's kind of caught in this peculiarly 1950s bind. She wants to be a career woman. Her high school inscription is, her goal in life is to, quote, not be a housewife. So she has this gig as inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald. This was the long-expired Hearst newspaper from that day. And she would just walk the streets of Washington in, silk dress and stockings and heels and pearls, this heavy-ass Gravlax camera that she's carrying. And she would buttonhole people, very difficult to do. She was shy, and ask them just these random, very benign questions. What's your favorite meal? And then take their pictures, take down their answers, go back and develop the film, edit the stuff down. It was 6 columns a week. It was a real journalistic job. But at the same time, she is, being a young woman of her time and her class, is expected to find the right husband. And so she's kind of divided between those twin imperatives. But from what I got the sense of her, she didn't have a lot of friends at that time, certainly not a lot of female friends. So I figured, and she's kind of living with her mom and stepdad at this baronial place off of Potomac River, which is still there, still privately owned. And I just figured she'd be one of those kind of poor little rich girls wandering around. So that was my thought.
And it's interesting as well because Lem is friends, of course, first with Jack, but then the exploration in the book is really Lem's relationship with Jackie. And tell us, can Lem be friends? Can he be loyal to both Jack and Jackie? And is that the real tension of the book? I didn't figure that out until the end, but I don't want to know what your intent was.
Therein hangs the tale, in effect. Which direction does he choose? The reason I made them such good friends, and probably better friends on the page than they were in life, but I felt they should have been friends. They had a lot in common. They were both in their own way outliers. They both had grown up amidst great wealth without having any of their own. They were both these Europhiles, art lovers. They cared much more about culture than politics or touch football, in the case of the Kennedys. And they both loved this one man, perhaps a little more than they should have. So there was a lot to bind them there. So I imagined a summer of Sundays where they go out and they roam Washington as it would have been then, which is both similar and quite different to the one we know now. And I was touched by the idea of them finding each other in the midst of their loneliness.
So both of these books take place in the past. But I found them both to be very relevant to contemporary culture, to be relevant to current day societal challenges. Tell us, what would you like readers, after they read your stories, what would you like them to take away? What would you like them to consider about the book?
I guess this reaches a little further than about the book, but I have become completely obsessed in the current climate with the uses of history and the way history is talked about, the sort of sense that I have that a history which ostensibly we share is actually a wedge issue in our country, and to what purpose that's being created. And I think one of the things that became increasingly clear to me, not that I wasn't sort of aware of it before writing the book, but just the idea that the Civil War has never actually ended, and that I only believed it had ended because I identify with the North. And that I think that the victorious side in a conflict can persuade themselves that it's over, but the defeated side never feels that way. And you know, I've just, the whole connection of history to truth, of indoctrination as opposed to education, all of these things are very much on my mind these days, maybe even more so than when I finished the book. And I guess the thing that I would like people to notice most is that this dreadful occurrence in which our fellow citizens have become our enemies in a way that I don't really remember so much from earlier periods. But you know, the idea that that we don't just have a difference of opinion, but that we, you know, that we need to silence the other side in some way is just distressing, very distressing. And I think we should stop it, is basically my point.
I earlier talked about the people who didn't get into the historical record. We talked about women, we talked about people of color, but also queers. Gay people were also left out of history. And so the enterprise that's been behind this book, and the previous one too, Courting Mr. Lincoln, was to kind of, if you like, queer American history and show that there are these gay stories that are only now being told. Courting Mr. Lincoln, of course, is about Lincoln's relationship with Joshua Speed and Mary Todd, both of which were at their peak intensity in the same moment in Springfield, Illinois. I love seeing Lincoln in your book, by the way. He's a character there as well.
I read your book as part of my year of research.
Thank you very much. So yeah, it's just the idea of opening up people's minds to the people who've always been there, you know, just hiding in the corners of very public lives.
Great.
I would just like to point out one other thing the book shared in common, which is the assassination, the idea that there's an extra charge somehow to the story because we all know it's going to end with an assassination.
Yeah.
And I am old enough that I remember the Kennedy assassination very, very vividly.
Well, Lem was referred to as one of the White House widows shortly after Kennedy was assassinated. And I think it was just a recognition of the grief that not just he, but a nation felt. Talk about national unity. I mean, America grieved John F. Kennedy's death. I don't know if it would happen that way anymore. I think there'd be
That's a terrifying thing to think, isn't it? But yes, I think, but also, I also feel that in some way, the fact that we've never really been given a story about Kennedy's assassination that seems to adequately address the facts sort of opened the door to conspiracy theories in a way that I'm probably being very ahistorical in imagining that this was something new. But for me, it was the first time where I thought, this is an event of enormous importance. I am getting a lot of versions of it. None of them quite make sense.
Last question before we go to anybody in the audience who wants to ask a question. We have 2 microphones, so feel free to come up to ask questions. How do you know and this gets at just what you were talking about, how do you know when to end your story? Because your book ends, it's not very much after the assassination, so it's, and there's not very much on, actually, John Wilkes Booth's involvement. It's just the very last part of your book. And yours stops short as well. You don't get the full Jack or Jackie story. It ends at a certain point. So how did you choose when your stories were respectively going to end, when we know, just what you said, there's much longer histories that are at the tail end?
Well, in my mind, this is a courtship novel like the previous one I wrote. And so, to me, the climax of it comes with the wedding itself. And everything that happens later in time is an after echo of that coming together. I should also say that endings for me happen because I'm on deadline, which we talked about. We talked about this earlier. I actually like my deadlines because they let me know when it's time to wrap this up, and so it's all about. It's a combination of. I definitely have an idea of my. Did you know your ending?
Well, yes.
I mean, not the assassination, but did you know where you were going to end the book?
No,
I didn't either. I didn't either. Yeah. It came and found me. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
In fact, my initial impulse for the book was that it was going to be a book about the aftermath, about, what the impact of the assassination on this family was afterwards. But during that year of research, there was just so much that happened before, and it's a horribly long book. It's the longest book I've ever written. I will never write a book that long again. It's I can't carry it on a plane. It's ridiculous. And I, in a very unearned way, I think the fact that we all know where the story is headed gave it a sort of narrative tension that otherwise it might have felt just too episodic, maybe.
Anybody with questions, please come up. It looks like we have, welcome to come up to the microphone. Yes, sir.
Well, I like time travel, and
So do I, but let's do it properly.
and President Kennedy is my all-time hero. So really interesting here. A few years ago, Stephen King wrote a book called 11/23/63, which was basically time travel with respect to the Kennedy assassination. And a number, well, I guess one or two people kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I'm kind of curious in terms of when you created the Booth scenario, if you would choose to create a, I guess 415, 60, whatever, 64, 65, whenever Lincoln actually was assassinated. In other words, if you would choose to follow a Stephen King primer, so to speak, in terms of a time travel aspect.
First of all, I would just like to say that you are fooling no one. You are so obviously a time traveler. I spotted you the instant you got up.
It's the hair, isn't it? It's the hair. Yeah.
I have.
But I'm not from Kansas.
I had this idea because there have been a number of books in which a time traveler is able to go back and and save Lincoln, and then we try to look at what history would become if Lincoln had survived. And it occurred to me that of equal interest would be, and now because I'm old, I'm blanking on a name that I should have on my fingertips, but the conspiracy was supposed to kill Lincoln. It was supposed to kill Johnson, the vice president, and it was supposed to kill the Secretary of State.
Seward.
Seward. And Seward
Stanton.
was very much an abolitionist. What if Johnson had also been killed, as he was supposed to be? Seward was attacked, but survived. What if Seward had? That's the story I would look at.
That would be a great story.
It would be, wouldn't it?
It's terrific. You have, over here?
As process, how do you work with your editors? I mean, what is that individually? What is your relationship like with your editors while you're going through this long, arduous process?
I'm checking to see if my editor is in the room anywhere. I have a great relationship with an editor, and because we approach it differently. Karen writes her books, but basically on spec. As far as you write the book and then you have someone buy it, whereas I tend to get a contract in advance. So then it becomes this collaborative process with the editor who weighs in very, very firmly. The first draft of the current book of Jackie and Me is kind of rising out of the ashes of the first one. And I sulked for about a week and then realized he was right and then kind of got back to work.
The thick skin is really helpful.
Yeah, I know you have to, right? I don't know.
I had the same editor on every every book that I wrote in my now 40-plus career up until her death a couple of years ago. And so this is my first book ever with a new editor. We are, she's terrific, she's fabulous, but she's different. The editor that I had, Marion Wood, was extremely blunt. There was no way to mistake what she was trying to convey to you, and it usually came with a lot of expletives. And my new editor is much more polite, and sometimes I hang up the phone and I think, okay, what did she say to me? Because clearly there was something she was conveying, but so gently that maybe I missed it. She's great, you know, it's a big change. It's a big change.
Thank you.
I had an editor like Marianne, I miss her still, Marjorie Brayman. She was wonderful and so blunt, so blunt.
Over here.
Something you said about how men of a certain generation and beyond are not really able to acknowledge being gay struck a chord with an analogous situation. I'm on the spectrum, and it's very clear to me that pretty much all my relatives are, but if you go past a certain point, none of them can really use that language. I mean, my mom, when I was growing up, would stomp around the house mumbling to herself, and I learned to swear from my dad doing things like screaming, flaming effing idiot. These are not normal experiences to have, and I realize that. But there's a wall there that they have a conception of what that terminology means that is very different from their own childhoods, and that has changed, and it's valenced in a certain way. That's a wall that I've learned not to try to bait my way through, because I am never, ever going to get there. They are never going to see that, even though it may be obvious to everyone around them. Is that sort of a similar situation?
I love that analogy. The thing is, you got there, so you're the hope, right? Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
I was just going to ask you, which seems to you the more enviable position, to be where you are or to be where they are?
I think I have it better insofar as when I finally found a partner recently, I found someone who has the same tick in her leg that I do, and it's going pretty well.
Hi, thank you very much. Allow me to preface this to say the last time I had the courage to ask a question at the National Book Festival was in the 90s with Paul Theroux when it was out on the National Mall. But two-part comment question. Louis, I discovered you reading The Black Tower years and years ago. I don't know.
That is the first of your books that I read as well.
Oh, good.
And learning about Inspector Vidocq.
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe you could share with the audience a little something about him, because just a fascinating character. And,
Oh, sure.
you know, it reminds me how people like Sidney Riley, the British spy, probably was the seed for Ian Fleming's James
Oh,
Bond.
right.
But, okay, that's one thing. And then my question is, what would your advice be to aspiring writers considering a project that might be based on less famous people, relatively little-known people, but where we're piecing together information we have with a lot of unknowns? In my case, I'm working on something around my mom's career before she met my father and before I came into the picture, but based on correspondence I discovered long after her passing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so thanks a lot.
Well, I'll start briefly. The Vidocq, the book he's referring to, is about Eugène-François Vidocq, who was considered the first real detective in history. He was a real-life figure in sort of post-Napoleonic France, and a wonderful character to hang with. The only one I've ever thought of. You've never done a sequel, right?
No, I
No, I've never done a sequel either. It's the one time I thought, because I love that character so much. But in terms of where to start, it sounds like you have an amazing place to start with. You've got these letters, right?
More generally, for anyone.
Oh, for anybody. Oh, gosh. I'll lateral it to Karen.
You know, I think that, that when you are dealing with people who are unknown to the general public, that you have a freedom. You know, this was the difference I felt in the books that I'd done prior to this one and this one, that I was making people up in general and putting them in situations. And I would think, even if you are not completely making them up, it's more like that experience of creating a character, and there's no one to tell you you've done it wrong, which is always, you know, in general, when you write historical novels, there is always someone who can tell you.
Oh, yeah.
I tell myself that by having made that egregious mistake and allowed them to discover it, I have provided them with more pleasure than a book that was actually flawless would have done.
Over here.
Good afternoon. Thank you both for coming. I'm particularly intrigued by Lou's turn to queer historical fiction. And so I'm wondering, this is actually an invitation to both authors, if you'd be interested in talking about what you're working on next, if you're to say what you want to share it, or just what can we expect from you next? And particularly, Lou, is there more queer historical fiction coming?
There is, which is as far as I can speak. I have been enjoined into silence on the subject, but I am working on something. It does not involve presidents. I've done 3 presidents now, and when I say done, I mean I've written about them. So I'm done with presidents, but not done with. I kind of like the queer angle. It's enjoyable. Yeah. Thank you for asking that, though. What's your next?
I wish I knew. I got the idea for the Jane Austen Book Club by seeing a sign in a bookstore that said the Jane Austen Book Club, which I momentarily thought was a book, but turned out to be a book club. I got the idea for We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves by talking to my daughter and having describing something to her and having her say, that should be your next book. So I don't have good ideas, but I know them when I hear them, and I really am begging you to tell me what to write next, because
How much are you willing to pay for a good idea?
My daughter, who has now written a book of her own, has told me that that source has dried up, that she is not giving me her ideas anymore. So
So I want to first say that I love both history and lit and everything like that. My favorite genre is, you know, the sweeping epics like 100 Years of Solitude and whatnot. And so, like, my question is there a historical event or person that is essentially like the castle on the hill for you that you just love to take on, or just, that, like, if you could just spend the rest of your career like working on this book, what would it be?
I've got an ancestor, a direct ancestor, who was an accused witch in Hartford, Connecticut in 1662. 20 years before Salem, there was a panic in Hartford. And I have tried to get that damn book off the ground twice. I've written something like 10,000 words, 12,000 words each time, and it just won't fly. So I think maybe the universe needs to come visit me in some way to help me figure this out. So I don't know if that's on the hill. It's the one that still keeps getting away from me. I want to do it, but I don't know how yet.
you know, if I had an answer to that question, I'd probably be working on the book very happily. I'm currently intrigued with one of my aunts because, and this is, you know, this again is just an illustration of how little faith we can put in history. I was told my entire life that I had an ancestor who fought in the Civil War. My grandfather wanted to join one of those Sons of the Civil War clubs. This ancestor was named Tom Burke. either died of malaria before he saw his first battle, or he was a different Tom Burke who was killed as a deserter. And my grandfather could join the club if he had died of malaria, but he could not join the club if he had been shot as a deserter. I've heard this story my whole life, so imagine my shock when my sister-in-law got into genealogy and discovered that the first Burkes in my family came to the US in the 1870s, that none of them are named Tom. There are some Patricks, that nobody in my family ever fought in the Civil War. So I'm dealing with this revision, and I'm very focused on who came up with this story, who's the fantasist in my family. And I'm focusing on my Aunt Elvira because she has also told me that my Uncle Bob had a torrid affair with Georgia O'Keeffe. Wow. And that there were love letters between the two of them, but they were so filthy that she had to burn them before anybody could read them. And so my suspicion
I mean,
is
Karen, this is
landing
your
on
next
her.
novel. I don't know. I mean, you've answered your own question here.
Yes.
We have time for maybe, if we can keep the questions really brief, we can do both of your questions.
Okay. So I get this dilemma as a teacher and a tour guide. And so I have a question about history and fact and truth. One dilemma is either people don't know enough history, like I have to describe what a radio is, or the other dilemma is nobody wants to hear the truth. And so, and they get mad at basic facts, like, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, and you have an argument for the next 20 minutes. So how do you either deal with people either not knowing history and you're over-explaining what you think are simple concepts, or people knowing history, but the truth just infuriates people and you get in an argument over what do you think are basic facts? So how do you deal with that as historians or historical fiction writers? Because I find myself censoring 90% of the stuff that I say, either to not cause an argument or because people just don't know, and I would spend 20 minutes describing what a radio is. So how do you deal with that?
I'm amazed there are people in the world who don't believe Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. That's astonishing to me, yeah.
I think that maybe it's not that they don't believe he owned them, but that they believe this is not an important fact to be shared. That, there are other things you can say about Thomas Jefferson. Why are you choosing this one? As I said earlier, this whole subject has been obsessing me, particularly as we are watching in school board meetings and state governments decisions being made to not tell the history to the extent that we actually see it and can defend it. That history is, that maybe the purpose of history is to make patriots out of us, and that looking at what our actual history is does not lead us to that end. I've got no answers for you except to say that I'm obsessing over this
I'll just
very
add that
issue.
fiction is sometimes the sugar that makes the medicine go down, I find. If you can create a fictional context to explore these exact issues, people may be able to follow you there, but who knows?
And the other quick thing is, you were talking about the young lady from your book, The Sister, and I thought about another young lady from history that's super interesting, and her name is, I believe it's Alice Roosevelt. It's one of Teddy Roosevelt's daughters.
Yeah.
There's oldest daughter, and probably the most interesting. Yes, absolutely.
Hilarious. Yeah.
Well, that's all we have time for, but Karen and Lou are both signing their books downstairs from 6 to 7, and I recommend both of them to everyone in this room. They gave me hours and hours of endless enjoyment this summer. So thank you for coming once again to the National Book Festival, and thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Colleen.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you.